Hello there and welcome to Equity Story. My name is Dawid Malinowski and I'll be your host for today. In this section of our segment we have two guests. Mateusz Ciasnocha, who is a farmer at Ciasnocha Family Farms and CEO of the European Carbon Farmers. Welcome, Mateusz.
Thank you.
And we have also with us Joel Kramer, who is the Resource Conservation District agricultural expert of the greater San Diego County. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So, gentlemen, today we are meeting to discuss our food. So essentially stuff that we need as humans, as animals. And as everything in life, this segment of business also evolves. So food of today and tomorrow, what are the challenges, opportunities, I suppose, and how does the food production sector come to all of this, in your view? So I suppose the best place for us to start our discussion today would be to ask you, so how has the food production been changing over the last few years? How has it been evolving in your view, let's say in the last 5 to 10 years? What's your view on that?
Joel, as a guest to Poland, would you like to kick us off?
Thank you for your hospitality. I'd say we were on a trajectory in the last decade of really focusing on organics and then starting to shift to regenerative practices. Mm-hmm. And there was a market building for that. But when major supply shortages hit due to COVID and the war in Ukraine, among other factors, people really shifted from not just wanting their food to be healthy, but to having a relationship with their food, to knowing the producers that they work with. And that really lent a lot of opportunities to producing higher quality food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and building on that, I would say there's a growing awareness, at least in certain pockets of society and stakeholders connected with not only food production, but more broadly food system, mm-hmm. which includes both fiber and energy as well, on top of just food production, of connectivity. And I need to have systemic approaches, and also have systemic approaches to regulation, which is a hugely important factor across the world, with EU and the US included. And one example that I think we can give from our trip here to Poland of seeing that happening in practice, mm-hmm. at the bottom-up level with regulatory consequences is a farm called Hereford, Mazury, that we visited a few days ago, mm-hmm. that transformed itself from producing food conventionally in a way that was not very profitable and highly destructive for the environment, mm-hmm. meaning plowing basically hills in Mazury region, to having animals, first of all, and secondly, having those animals in what is called the holistic management system. So moving around the farm of 500 hectares, mm-hmm. A little bit every day in order to produce food, steward that ecosystem, and provide also employment opportunities for that area of Poland.
I see. So essentially it's been, from what you guys are saying, essentially that there's a different way in which the end consumer really starts to perceive, they have started to perceive food. So not just something that is kind of there on the shelf and that's it and you just kind of use it, but they are also interested in the broader story, if you like. So how is it being grown or harvested, where does it exactly come from? So there's much greater awareness in that sense, not just in terms of quality, but also, as you said, the origin of stuff. And the last recent pandemic and the massive disruption to various world global supply chains have only accelerated that process. Is that fair?
Certainly.
Yeah, you summarized it very well. Like COVID really helped with mm-hmm. consumer being more aware than ever that food is fragile, and it takes a system with farmers and other stakeholders in that system mm-hmm. to get that food to your plate. And that's mm-hmm. really a miracle that a lot of people are involved in and are doing tremendous job in getting us there. That's as simple as that.
I reckon that, for me personally, you see, it took these images from, various places in the world, like, for example, the UK, where, periodically during the recent pandemic, you had essentially empty shelves on, in stores. And then it only got me thinking how how important and vital this service is for for society to function. And we, oftentimes I would dare to say, we took it for granted until that point, haven't we, to a degree?
Yeah, it's so common. We do it so many times a day.
Yeah, we don't
have
think
a
about
meal
it, do we?
Exactly that, and that's why there's so many opportunities. Is at least 3 times a day. Hopefully, we have an opportunity to build that relationship with the food and the community that produces it, and get to know the land that we belong to better.
Of course,
precisely. And if there are any farmers, which I hope there are watching us, I think there's an invitation right there for you, which is go out and tell your story as a farmer, right? As a consumer, yes, go out and be interested in your food.
Yeah, of course.
If you have the means, because not all of the consumers for every single product or food category have the luxury of
being able to express, what
exactly,
they think.
and follow that up. But the invitation is build a bridge, right? If you are a farmer, tell your story, be exposed to be challenged as well in that process, and get better as a result. So that what we started with, the food system, will get as a consequence of that stronger, because it's fairly fragile right now.
Sure. And in terms of, so we discussed, how it, how it was growing and developing over the last, 5 to 10 years time. What do you reckon the future holds? So how do you see this whole very fragile system, as you gentlemen mentioned, evolving over time, particularly with all these things happening? I'm sure I don't have to tell you about the issues with grain in relation to the recent armed conflict just to the east of Poland's border. And so how do you think that will impact the supply chains and the way in which people think about food, and what the future has in store for us in that respect, would you reckon?
Please, Mateusz.
Happy to start. So the impact is already there. It's not let's discuss the impact and then decide which one we allow to happen. The impact is happening already, and we had a tremendous one other meeting that we would like to kind of share with the audience is we met with Good Valley, which is one of the largest farms in Poland, one of the largest producers of pork in our country, and at the same time a leader when it comes to biogas and renewable energy. They built the first biogas plant in Poland that we visited, and they have 9 in total right now. And we had a tremendous discussion with the leadership there, who was basically making a point that, if we, let's say, don't produce that one pig, so many other industries are affected because the side streams and different products are feeding into whatever the numbers was, 200 other products that you might not think pig is in those products. So recognizing that we are connected, and this is true right now, is, from my perspective at least, a starting point. And then what I would like to see going forward would be, and here the US is a tremendous example of how to do that right, both at the farmer level and in many other sectors of the economy, how to reclaim your agency.
I see. Okay.
In the Polish conditions in particular, and let's focus on Poland because that's what I can speak to with an experience as a farmer and somebody who's working with farmers. We often wait for somebody to make the move, and unless that happens, whatever that is,
we'll move.
We need this piece of regulation.
See in this sense.
We need a subsidy for this, right? And very often we do need regulatory changes or new regulation, or we need subsidies for some things, but do the first step, take action in order to realize your vision. And for that, you need a vision. You need to have a vision of a food system that few players in the food system have. They can talk at length about the fears and worries connected with the challenges that we've been discussing. Yeah. But when it comes to vision and leadership, that's a challenge. And the vision that I will be proposing is a world in which every single farmer is being aware that he or she is a steward of ecosystem. That is a huge gift and responsibility, and he or she has the tools to manage that. And carbon farming, understood as a carbon cycle that is embedded in the ecosystem that the farmer is stewarding and his or her farm is embedded in, would be my entry point in order to realize that vision. And that basically builds directly on what you might be aware of, which is the Gupta review for Her Majesty's government that basically concluded that, hey, we are growing GDP, but at the same time, kind of proportionally, we are decreasing natural capital on which that very GDP is dependent
Relies on. So it's like a vicious cycle in a way.
So the question is, how do you turn it around? And like kind of redefine the system. And farmers can and should be playing a central role in this new system that we both Joel in the US and me in Poland and our partners across the world are trying and are working on.
Yeah.
In terms of our American cousins, what's
Cousins.
yeah, well,
I like that.
I like that.
That's you oftentimes hear that in Britain. People kind of say, "Oh, our American cousins." It's a thing apparently. But anyway, so Joel, what do you reckon about this? Where are we heading with all this?
Yeah, well, I like how you mentioned the fragility of the system earlier. We have a good system in that we're interdependent on one another, but perhaps too much so at times. And Mateusz, I agree with you that farmers can play a role in building from the ground up some of that resilience and the stability, but we need governmental support to do that. Okay. We're not looking at totally isolating to like a town scale or a gmina scale for local food production, but at the same time, we can't sustain this global production in terms of and distribution due to supply shocks. And so I think the way forward that I see is kind of more regionalization, where we reduce to kind of a mid-scale of production where we can trade goods within these areas, but we're not entirely dependent on if some specialty crop isn't available. And that, again, is where I see Good Valley as a good example, is they're a large-scale farm with more than, I believe, 40,000 hectares.
No, 13.
13? Okay, I'm thinking in acres. But they're still exporting, and they're still importing some supplies. But if a supply shock were to happen, they would be able to adapt because they have a lot of regionalized centers throughout Poland that they could isolate and rely on local resources to get through that difficult time. Yeah. So I think kind of founding a moderate scale that we can operate on and planning for those shocks is what we need to be doing.
I remember from the recent pandemic, sorry that I keep on, obviously it's...
we all lived through it, so we can all relate.
I suppose, but that's the thing. I mean, I keep on coming back to this. At the same time, I'm fully aware that, most of us, including, surely our viewers would love to forget about the whole spiel. But one of the things that I've heard during this COVID pandemic is that unlike some other countries, Poland is actually quite food sovereign in the sense that we produce more kind of basic and essentials in terms of food that we need. So it's not like with the disruption of the supply chains in the country will have significant issues. Is that fair? Do you reckon?
From my observation, it has been. And what do you think, Mateusz?
Yeah, I think knowing more the insights, I think we have very fragile food system. Okay. Because when you look across the value chain, and here we are talking to audience that is financially savvy. When you look at the value chain and you look at the basically the numbers, the economics of different players in the food system, especially farmers, those are very fragile. Starting even from, as I like to call it, applied economic or financial knowledge. So as a farmer, of course, like, if I plant this, I will have this level of cost, this level of revenues. Like, therefore, I will make money. Yeah. Precisely. But then the rubber hits the road when you actually like run your farm, and a lot of the farms that I know are not really making money. And what is more worrying than that is that they don't know they are not making money.
So they rely on subsidies, and from kind of month to month, they kind of get by.
Precisely.
But the economics of it is not as up there as it should be. Is that what you're trying to say?
That's what I'm trying to say. So we focus on production and driving efficiencies, like understood as let's produce more, because we have now 8 billion people or more than 8 billion people to feed, 10 billion soon. Yeah. So we have to produce, right? And yes, we have to produce food. We have to also deliver it to where it is not available, either at times or structurally. So you talk about how that system works and how do you see the balance of trade, like more like issues that the farmer cannot deal with, but is affected by definitely. Where policy comes in, and you have all those considerations to make. So I would say, like, there's definitely there are so many things to celebrate, and the EU has been fundamental in taking our food system, especially farmer level reality, to the next level. Like it has been a huge resource, and we've taken tremendous advantage of that. But we do have challenges in the system that we should be addressing proactively, because with COVID, climate and conflict coming in, and maybe more shocks to the system coming and like reinforcing each other, we might not have the luxury of basically adapting on a timescale that we were adapting so far, but we will have to be ready for what is coming.
Yeah, clearly. I mean, from the fairly recent experience, that might be, well, hopefully will not, there's nothing around the corner that will make us, that will make us, make us have to rethink about, different ways in which we apply in which we consider our supply chains, etc. There's no such a shock around the corner, hopefully. But you mentioned the fact that, well, it's a fairly recent thing that we have 8 million people 8 billion people in the world right now, and clearly we have to feed these people, in some fashion. In terms of the challenges that poses, if you were to both of you to kind of sum it up and list, perhaps each one of your 3 main challenges in that respect, with a growing population, when it comes to efficiency in food production.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing what we've done so far, and it's because of a lot of the technologies we've implemented, but also because of the changes in social structure. So land ownership has changed a lot, ownership structures have changed a lot, and to me that seems a really important thing moving forward, is that we're going to need to intensify production. And do that based on markets that are complementary to one another, but we're going to have to do that in collaboration with one another. So I've been so impressed with the tours of farms that Mateusz has shown me in Poland, where some farmers have really, really pulled together an amazing facility with top-notch equipment that allows them to very rapidly cultivate their fields and save time. But the cost of that investment is such that they're not necessarily able to take advantage of other regional opportunities, so they're selling to large-scale national markets. And I think a more efficient way would be to have some of that equipment be available among a group of farmers in a clustered region that are specializing on certain commodities, and adding value to those products and having processing facilities locally, so that there's less effort being put into an individual piece of land, and they're able to get more value out of it.
So kind of shared economy in a sense, how we now share rights and all that sort of stuff. So is that kind of what you're getting at with this? Because obviously in one region, in region A, it can be famous for, say, its olive branches or cotton or any other produce. Some sort of sharing arrangements in that sense when it comes to equipment and the way in which people use certain resources. Is that?
It is, and taking advantage of that, not so that there's a limited supply of that machinery, but that you're not just investing in the machinery, but also the processing, the distribution, the marketing, and that's being done on a regional level. I think kind of spreading those resources a bit would be more profitable in the long run.
Yeah, and picking on that, like reflecting on the Polish reality, what would be needed and is being done partly to implement this kind of vision is to have one agency that is leading the process, right? So Joel talk about, for example, building
so this leadership factor.
Leadership factor and clarity of goal, like a vision, like, hey, we want to, like, there's something missing, we are addressing that, and we all are working to get to that goal. So indeed, like a lot of farmers that we've visited and other farmers that I am working with, they know and they really need, for example, local processing for the meat they are producing. But the bureaucratic burden of going through the process of permitting, getting approvals, and then running that facility is huge, right? So, and that results in basically a reality that you only have the large players operating. Same thing with biogas. Like we've heard from many players, especially at the conference where we've been yesterday, a promise small-scale biogas can play in our increasing economic reliability of farms, closing the loop when it comes to nutrient cycles, so addressing very important challenge there, and of course impacting our local and therefore national energy security, which is, has been there for many years and is really important. But then when you get from the level of a potential into implementation, as we've been doing with our farm, then you hit the normal reality of, hey, I have to have so many permits, they are really expensive, and if I divide that by small investment, which a small-scale biogas plant is, it basically doesn't make sense. You have to go big.
So the scale
is really important. So the question is, how do you decrease financial and otherwise burden in order to enable this local initiatives that farmers at scale should be taking? We are not talking about, hey, if 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 farmers do that in Poland, we have a success, right? We should be talking and aiming for, hey, we need 10,000, we need 1,000, we need large numbers. And then once again, sharing some of our insights of me going to the US with this opportunity and others, and Joel coming here on this opportunity, and hopefully many others in the future. What works really well in the US, and we would like to share that here, is the extension system. So in the US, universities, those that are doing research, are at the same time running extension services to farmers, so being agricultural advisors. In Poland, that system is separated. We have research institutes and we have advisory services, which of course are talking to each other, and that knowledge transfer is happening, but it's much less efficient than it is in the US. And there's a very clear kind of case, just like there are many others that we can share from California or the US more broadly, that if you build a bridge, if you just, not just, but like if you happen to go and talk and think and share and challenge each other, great things emerge from that.
Yeah. I have an acquaintance who, I think he's a professor for one of these extensions at Texas Agricultural and Mechanical University. Is that the
Texas
one?
A&M.
Yeah, Texas A&M.
Who's that?
Jim Mazurkiewicz.
Yeah, we have a call with him later today.
Oh, there we go. It's a small world,
Small Polish
effectively.
world. Cousins across the pond, huh?
Yeah.
Essentially, yes.
So this is our capital as well, human. Like Jim is a huge.
He's a lovely man.
He's an amazing
lovely
leader.
man, yes.
Small world.
It's a small world indeed, gentlemen.
Look, this is our agenda, and this is Dr. Jim Mazurkiewicz here.
There we go. Say hi to Jim from me, please.
I will.
So you've connected with him as well?
No, I actually, with Jim, we met at a conference where I hosted a panel. That was a few months ago. But that's how we met.
He told me about you then, because he told me you have to meet this young man, and we are here.
It's amazing how small this world is, ladies and gentlemen. Anyhow, we touched upon challenges quite a lot in this discussion, right? And we obviously mentioned, things like, customer awareness, how people became a wee bit more activist in their approach, a bit more choosy, more interested in the whole story as to where their foods, what they put on the table for their family. Where does it actually come from? So customer behavior, but what about, and also you mentioned the different, issues with, the red tape, right, the legislation and, different puns and stuff. So to kind of touch a bit more on that, perhaps it's because I'm a lawyer, I'm interested.
Nobody's perfect.
Yeah, just wanted to kind of see in terms of the legislative initiatives and changes and the general way in which this whole thing is going, both, I suppose, here in the EU and in the US. What do you reckon? What are the challenges? And we can talk about these challenges, and I, promise there'll be no more challenges that we'll try to kind of bring up.
Let's see. That's a nice vision. So maybe starting with the US side first, the challenges there.
Yeah, I think it really varies regionally. Rather than a regulation, I think in my mind, one thing is actually subsidies. In the US, we very heavily subsidize certain crops. And so we have a landscape that's not very diverse, and it has a lot of ecological issues that come along with that, but also market vulnerabilities. So I think the subsidy structure is important. And then it's not necessarily a regulation, but one huge barrier to advancing our farming in the US is access to land and the access to capital that goes along with that. So
if I can just sorry to interject, but in the US, access to land, it's a huge country, isn't it?
It is.
As in, like, you always think about the, sorry, obviously, I'm just kind of semi-laughing, because obviously when you think about the US, it's just this like monstrous, great, large country with, all these, beautiful nature from, from west to east, south to south to north. So surely you mean like land which is specific for particular agricultural purposes, right?
I mean, you're right. There's a lot of land available, but we have this kind of bucolic vision of agriculture that it's you just acquire a family farm that you've been a part of, or perhaps the farm isn't that expensive because it's just dirt. But it actually takes a lot of money, not just to get the land itself, but to get the infrastructure, to get things up and running.
Essentially.
Especially if you're doing perennial crops, then there's a minimum 5-year investment before you're making money back. So think about a young farmer who's dedicated to addressing these issues of efficiency and global supply and regionalization. Where do they even start if they can't get a bank loan?
That's a tough sell, for someone even to consider going into that business, right? As you said, 4 or 5 years window before you can actually start doing stuff?
For perennial crops, yeah. Some would start with smaller margins on vegetable crops. But it's a big challenge. And then on top of it, there is the regulation that we're trying to address these environmental issues largely, or there's global competition. For example, where I come from in San Diego, the avocado industry is frustrated by a lot of the competition with Mexican markets. And so as a farmer, you can feel very small and insignificant many times, even though you're an essential part of the global system.
I can relate to that feeling of being insignificant. There is, I think, reflecting on what Joel is sharing and our insights and learnings from the last days, there's a fundamental difference in the way US and Europe works. And we touched upon that before a little bit, which is, in the US, if you have an idea or a challenge, like you take action, you have agency to act on it, right? You call your senator or congressman, you talk with the farmer next to you, and so on. And here, a
bit more activism, effectively.
Precise.
People kind of taking, proper or American approach of people kind of taking stuff to their hands, to their own hands, and getting things done, except for just perhaps suffering in the silence. Yeah,
we can call it like that. So like if there's one very small change you can make is this, like make a small change of taking action to act on something that is important for you, right? Like I often talk with farmers who would be complaining and the list goes on and on and on.
But he doesn't do anything about
exactly,
it, really.
Like you ask, like, what have you done on this issue? Nothing. Oh, so it's not really pressing. What did you do on this issue?
It is pressing, but I haven't done anything.
Exactly. So therefore, it's not pressing. Right?
I think it's a mentality issue, isn't it?
I don't want to blame it on mentality only, but then to kind of, so like this is definitely a factor that is very, very important. And like once again, human to human connection. You've mentioned Dr. Jim, amazing example here, Joel and YTD Fellowship that we are both benefiting from. Many others, tremendous examples of how to kind of support agency and act on it as well. But then from higher level perspective, when I think about the EU and challenges there, many of which are similar to challenges in other parts of the world, is at the core siloed policy making process. And that,
so it's not like broad.
It's not systemic. Let me give you an example, which is very present in the reality that we are in right now, which is you do have agriculture ministry setting our agriculture policy, which just like in the US case, the Farm Bill Day agriculture policy is being negotiated right now and will be, if everything goes according to the plan, from next year, it will be in power for the next 5 years after being negotiated. European agriculture policy called the CAP, Common Agriculture Policy, in the Polish case has already been negotiated, and we know what the national strategic plan for that policy is. For the next 5 years. It should be for 7 years, but we had a delay with negotiating European policy because of COVID and other factors. So it will be only for 5 years. And that policy is moving in the right direction. But when you benchmark it against what our other ambitions and policies are in climate in particular, they don't square at all. We are using different metrics. We are using different language. And what is the key thing is that the narrative at the farmer level is you want me either to produce food or care for the environment. There's very little narrative of hey,
But it can be achieved.
you
at the
can
same
do both,
time.
and actually you should be doing both, and we are here with this policy to support you in doing that. So there's an issue of both the technical issue of how to do it, which in our view as European carbon farmers is to transform the CAP from action-based payments, in which we are in right now, to results-based payments, in which we should be in order for this policy to speak with our climate objectives, especially methane reduction pledge from Glasgow till 2030. And then there's a lot of kind of soft policy making and implementation, especially around the narrative, that is equally critical. Yes, and maybe that won't be a very optimistic view, but as of now, with where the policies are, basically the protests that we have had in the Netherlands and Germany of farmers this year are a very likely reality in Poland. I cannot tell you whether they will happen in the next 3, 5, or 7 years.
Of course.
But sadly, they will happen. And if you take a little bit broader view, you can very clearly see why that will be the case. But if you are kind of following the policy that has certain boundaries, which it has, then you are either not seeing that or pretending that will not happen.
I mean, it sounds like there's still a lot of work to be done, especially when it comes to, I suppose, aligning everything with this kind of approach that, you should take a step back and look at the whole issue as opposed to just trying to address bits of different issues.
Correct.
Which are essentially interconnected to one another, but people seem to fail at noticing that. Well, it's
Correct. And like my approach, and I guess our approach for doing that would be, hey, in order to step back, we need a common language, right? That which then will take us in that conversation forward. And this is a lot of people, and probably you guys as well, talked about carbon farming or carbon credits. Which everybody's talking about as a very quick way of paying farmers for doing what they've been always doing, and we lack a strategic conversation about what we really mean by carbon farming. And thesis that I and we as European carbon farmers are proposing is every single farmer of the world is a carbon farmer, because he or she stewards a carbon cycle that is embedded in her ecosystem that the farm is embedded in. And then you can be a good, average or bad carbon farmer from that perspective, right? But nobody is looking at that issue as an issue of, hey, let's build a bridge, let's bring everybody in so that we can be having a result-based, rooted in science and reality conversation, but like, hey, I feel that or I think about that.
And it's fragmented, essentially.
It's very fragmented and very political. And once again, a specific example to bring how to move the needle forward from California that I've learned about when I've been there earlier this year is you also have another CAP, which is a cap and trade system that we also have in the European Union, but California has their own. And some of the money that are generated through that are basically flowing to Californian agriculture for different programs, helping farmers to adapt and mitigate climate change. And similar thing or similar approach could be taken in Poland. It won't take us all the way, but
it's a start.
But it can take us a lot further, especially when it comes to creating this bridge between climate and agriculture, which right now is, some of us feel there is a connection to be made.
There's a conflict as opposed to a bridge being
precisely
under construction, really. And in terms of, I suppose, differences, really, gentlemen, and at least from my perspective, again, when I used to live in England, you heard a lot about, for instance, how there was a debate at one point whether Britain, after Brexit, if memory serves correct in terms of timing, whether Britain should allow certain US produced meat, food that is produced in the US, to be allowed on its domestic market. And well, for some reason, there was a significant amount of people who didn't quite like the idea, because the running argument was that, the US made food is of different quality, or is made or produced according to different standards, which are not considered good enough here in England or in the EU. Regardless if that is true or not, what do you guys reckon, based on your respective experiences of CE market / European Union and obviously the US, what are the kind of differences in terms of how food is produced here in the EU and in the US, and why do we even have this debate to begin with?
You would like me to start? Happy to.
Please do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not entirely familiar with the European system, but my overall impression from the last couple of weeks is that there's harsher restrictions in many ways. So GMOs being entirely banned, I don't think that's a status we have. We have a lot of organic agriculture, but we don't have exact requirements on how much there needs to be. I think there's a goal for 25% of EU produce to be organic, whereas we just have kind of different regions that are excelling due to the market forces. So I think there's a different level of regulation. And then also of subsidy, as I mentioned earlier, corn, soy makes up so many of not just our food products, but our fuels, our industrial goods, because the government invests heavily in those few crops. And so, for me, that seems very problematic for the stability of our system and our ability to adapt to new markets. So it feels like there's some contrast there, and of course some similarities as well that we can dig into later.
Yeah, from my perspective, I think food and different actors in the US food system, especially farmers, are more financially aware and are making decisions that are driven by financial considerations to a greater extent than the European counterparts would. And it would be very beneficial to improve at the
more market sort of forces driven approach, really. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. And being more aware of like, hey, we are here as entrepreneurs, right? Who steward the ecosystem, yes, but like we are entrepreneurs, not as people who need subsidies in order to survive, and we struggle all our life, which is both a technical kind of challenge in nature and very much a narration cultural challenge. So that would be the biggest one that I'm seeing. Both of which, meaning like the US system and the European system, have huge global consequences, right? So when we are having a debate about should we like allow this product from somewhere, say the US, into the European Union, what is broadly called Global South is watching at the debate closely and also thinking like, oh, like how do we position ourselves in that debate? So
knock-on effect, effectively.
Precisely, and our systems, both the European and American, are based on principles of trying to provide abundance of food, and when you have too much, you just kind of export it outside, which has a negative consequences of the ecosystem. Right? We mentioned the Gupta review. We've mentioned the natural capital decreasing. That's the consequence of that. Like we don't have limitless environment and nature that we can just kind of use as a resource. No,
yeah, and of course these resources are obviously, and as I'm sure you will know better than I do, finite by their nature, really, and it's very important for us to be able to utilize them in the correct and sustainable way, obviously.
Or even regenerative, right?
Exactly.
Because if our baseline is very low, which often case it is, you don't really want to keep that at a sustainable level, because at its core, looking a little bit more broadly, it won't be sustainable, right? And let me give you an example, which is the state of soil health in Poland in particular. Like our soils are on average very poor, and they are at the stage in which they are prone to natural desertification. So
is it because of exploitation?
Yes.
So heavy exploitation, not kind of looking forward-looking, but also a policy to preserve them and sustain them.
Precisely. We have the policy though, and
now, but what you're saying is we didn't have it, beforehand. Is that part of the problem?
We had access to technology, understood as technology that you can touch, tractors, plows, machines, and our knowledge, and once again applied knowledge of how to use those machines was not there, or was not growing as quickly as our access to technology that you can touch and feel. And one particular thing I would mention is so-called EU Soil Health Mission that we talked about before, that is both a funding mechanism within Horizon Europe budget, and more broadly an ambition to connect what would be normally disconnected agencies of the European Union, research and agriculture, to address this issue, not only in agriculture, but across European soils. So have a look at the call that will be opening by the end of this year to start implementation of the first set of lighthouses and demo farms. Lighthouses are areas in which research is being done, and demo farms are areas or places in which that practice that has been researched is implemented. And I would encourage everyone to have a look at that and participate in that, because we do have policy, we have analysis of the problem, we have policies to address those problems. We do have resources on both sides of the ocean in the US and in Europe to address those challenges, with tremendous examples of how to do things right, with great leadership that is willing to share, and let's build on what is already happening.
And I think where we're seeing that being implemented and those opportunities being taken advantage of, it is on individual farms who recognize that while there are mounting pressures of increasing costs and climate pressures, consumer demand and the type of demand, what they're asking for is shifting. And if we address that, if individual farm businesses address that, they leap ahead. They're able to adopt new practices. They're able to steward the land differently. It's partly storytelling, but it's also partly practical, that they change their mode of production in a more cost-effective way and are able to get a premium for doing so. So that feels like an opportunity in both locations, regardless.
Yeah. Okay. And in terms of, because we touched upon the fact that, things are evolving all the time, and that there are all these, initiatives and new ways of doing things that, be it governments or the actual farmers themselves, they want to implement into the food production business, into the whole supply chain. In terms of innovations in the food sector, how do you reckon these can be helped? Because we hear these days a lot about innovations in, say, in the financial services business, with all these cryptocurrencies, and in terms of other sectors, but in terms of agricultural business, how innovation in that sector can be helped, and if there's anything that you personally kind of came across recently, like a startup or an initiative that you found particularly interesting.
Yeah, I mean, on the hard technology side, I think there are certain implements that are being adapted in order to basically disturb the soil less and be more specific about what they do. And they are in high demand with the producers that I work with. But I think the correct use of them and the most profitable and ecological use of them depends on how they know, what they know about how to use it and what the different effects are. And I'll leave that to Mateusz to elaborate on.
Yeah, so I would say three things and an example. We talked about extension and applied research and extension, getting that out to farmers, tremendous examples of how to do that very well in the US, and more work needed in the European Union and the US, but we can learn a lot from each other. And once again, a very specific kind of tool that is their EU Soil Health Mission to access funding for being able to not only dream about that, but actually implement that in practice. We also talked about that briefly, but there's from my perspective, a very big need of moving from understanding technology as something that you can touch and buy to something that is knowledge-based, basically. Great farms in the US, in the European Union, in other parts of the world, are knowledge-heavy, are based on the intimate understanding of the ecosystem, and other sectors like economics or social dynamics and how the trends are going. And it's a pleasure to be at those farms and speaking with those farmer leaders, basically, because it's just an amazing experience. You can see the ownership and agency and caring and stewardship and all of that. So we need more of that. We need to move from, hey, I need a new tractor, to I need a new tractor because I will achieve something that I'm aiming for with it.
So it's essentially what you are talking about is that it is not a different, new tractor, as you put it. It's not some sort of an app on the phone or a technological gimmick as such. it's a shift in approach, it's a shift in mentality and way of thinking that is much broader, that will result in innovation and increased efficiency that is necessary, in the agricultural sector.
Correct.
Well put.
Correct. And that translates to agency, right? So we are not only talking about broad visions and dreaming, but we are talking about like physically using that metaphorical tractor differently today on your farm. Like not like, oh, like I've heard about the farm in Australia that is doing amazing things. It will not work here because we are in Poland and we have different climate, but let me try, let me experiment, let me be intentional about that. And very specific, right? And that brings me to an example which we've already mentioned, the European Carbon Farmers, a business that we started, me and the family business more broadly, because while we are a tremendous beneficiary, just like most of the Polish farms are, of the CAP, Common Agriculture Policy, we see this growing, we see and feel, and we are really concerned by this growing disconnection between climate policy and how it happens, or how it's being said and implemented, and our climate ambitions, which we see are very real, because, well, we travel around the world, but also, and we see climate change happening physically in different locations, but we also see it happening in our local area, which is, which like I can point and say like, hey, this was different so many years ago, 5, 3, 15. With a goal of building that bridge between the climate policy or ambitions, which will be turned into policy soon, and agricultural policy, with farmers in the very middle or at the very middle of that bridge, using carbon farming, this kind of comprehension that, hey, we are stewards and we need to understand how good or not of stewards we are, and how to be a good steward so that every farmer is a good carbon farmer, to address that.
So think about how I do things, that I have such a responsibility as a carbon actor, as you put it, and how I can essentially improve both the efficiency and in the way that I do not produce as much carbon emissions.
Yeah, and understanding that you have many options to do that. I think a lot of producers feel locked in. They've been doing this for a long time. It really worked at one point. Most of the people they know worked for them as well. And the people who are adopting some of these practices may not necessarily, in some cases they're leaders in the community, but in some cases they're just kind of early adopters. And so having trust in those new practices takes time. You have to see results. And so, it can take a little bit of time to not only learn what's available, but decide that you're going to take the financial leap to move over to that.
Precisely.
Well, gentlemen, we have talked about many very different aspects of food production, business, of agriculture. Final thoughts from both of you for our viewers. If you would like to kind of wrap up and summarize our discussion, can I start with you?
If you are not a farmer, go and visit the farmer. Pick a farmer that is closest to you, that you fancy, that can be like far away, whatever. But like literally go and visit the farmer.
Have a look.
Yes, and have a conversation, like engage in this bridge building activity. And if if it take, 8 hours to actually do it, like schedule in 20 minutes of your time in your calendar, like now, to do the first step, right? Like to look up, like, oh, okay, where do I find farmers? Let me just identify that. And then once you do that, like schedule another 20 minutes to continue in that process. And if you are a farmer, you are a carbon farmer. Like be aware that you are a carbon farmer and ask yourself a question and follow up on that. How good of a carbon farmer you are. And we as European carbon farmers are happy to help with answering that question.
Well, it's just a pleasure to be here in Poland. I've been really lucky to see the parts of Poland that I've seen and get to know people. I've had a lot of hospitality here. But when I came a couple weeks back, I felt like I was coming to a very different place, both in terms of distance, but climatically. And it's been amazing to learn the impacts of climate change here, how they've been affecting Poland in similar ways to my home in arid San Diego, that Poland is experiencing a drought right now, that there's issues with flooding that can be addressed with soil health. And so as much as we can adapt and we can ask farmers to take the lead in adapting to these climate impacts, even if we're successful at doing that, other regions around the world are going to find instability from climate change, and we're going to have to be sanctuaries for that. And so international collaboration really is essential.
Yes.
And so we need to be adapting locally, but we also need to be mitigating and sharing this knowledge and encouraging each other on. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, excellent. Is it your first time in Poland?
It's my first time. And I plan to come back, perhaps in the summer.
Well, I always say this to all my mates from outside of Poland that probably summer, spring is probably the best time to come. It's a bit more tuned up in terms of colors. Outside is nice grey, I suppose, as it can be over during winter.
Joel loved it in December, so it can only get better.
Indeed, go and get better. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Dawid Malinowski, and I've been hosting this program for you today with Mateusz Ciasnocha.
Thank you for having me.
And Joel Kramer.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, and take care. Bye-bye.